Sunday the 18th of September, and this is the day all the local lorry enthusiasts look forward to over here at the RNAS Museum at Yeovilton. It's the meeting of the HCVS, that's the Historic Commercial Vehicle Society's meeting that we enjoy every year here, and I suppose it's a favourite among all the lorry meets, because this is the day for the lorries and buses. Nothing to do with the tractors and the cars. This is the old drivers get together. And behind this you will see a good collection, as ever, of buses, lorries, vans, of some pre-war, some very old. We've got an old Model T going back to 1918. And during the day we're going to take you around and meet the drivers and the old vehicles, and see if we can make an interesting show for you. Morning, Roy. Nice to see you. Have a nice trip down?
Yes, we had a lovely trip down from Bristol this morning.
This is the AEC, this is your pride and joy, is it?
That's right, it is.
Yes. You've had since
1983, which was the Golden Jubilee of London Transport. We purchased it, well, I viewed it at the Golden Jubilee actually, although we purchased it from a dealer, not from London Transport itself. But it hadn't been with anyone else.
And what size engine is this one?
This is a 9.6, AEC 9.6 straight 6-cylinder diesel engine. The bus itself is number 1599 out of the 4,825 RTs, which was the famous RT that London ran from 1939 until 1979, 40 years.
And the gearbox in this one?
The gearbox is the Wilson Pre-Select.
Good old Wilson.
Yes, that's right.
Well-tried system. That
yes.
is. Of course, it must have made a lot of difference to the London bus driver not having to go up and down using his clutch all day long.
Yes,
Pre-Select.
That's basically why most of the London buses were like that. They even had London buses in 1932, 33 with a Pre-Select gearbox. The first ones came in.
And what year was this one built in, Roy?
This one was built in 1950. She was registered in February 1950, so built during 49.
Any idea the total mileage?
Not really, but we know that the fact that she did 29 years with London Transport, she must have done well over 1 million miles.
That's a long
must
way.
have done.
Now, going back to the Leyland behind here, that's another London Transport, about the same era?
That's right, yeah, that one, in actual fact, that one is a 1949. She's about 3 months older than the AEC one that's here today. And that one we purchased, or I purchased in 1985, 2 years later. But that one is fully restored and was fully restored by another preservationist who owned it before me. And he is actually here today because he drove it down for me.
Certainly a nice line-up of buses here.
Yes.
And how nice to see them in preservation. Thank you very much, Roy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, we've had a nice look over the AEC selection there, and the Leyland. And now we're into the smaller AECs now, the Model RF. The big double-decker, the RM, fully automatic gearbox. And an interesting job here, the Routemaster RMC. Now this one had a semi-automatic. It was built for the famous Green Line coaches. Well, AECs and Leylands weren't the only builders of buses. We have over the other side here the very famous and more local firm, the Bristol. Here, the old Bristol double-decker that I remember so well as a kid. They started running on our route from Shepton Mallet to Bristol back in the late 30s, early 40s. This one was on the Exeter run, I see. It's wonderful how they preserve these buses and keep them in their old livery. Here, a really high double-decker. It was Bristol who brought about the low-decker principle to bring down the height of some of these double-deckers. But when they were used only in towns, the height wasn't much of a problem. But when they started putting them on the country routes, of course, we had to bring the roof down a bit, and they did this by lowering the gangway upstairs. Well, this is certainly one of my favorites over here behind me, the single-decker Bristol. This is the one I remember so well as a kid, plodding through our village. And this is probably one of them. It's done the Bath and Bristol run, I see. It's got the old Bristol registration. They made some darn good buses, did Bristol. They made a lot of good vehicles. Quite a lot had the Bristol diesel engine in. This particular one has got a very unusual engine. It's built by Gardner, which we'll be hearing a bit more about Gardner engines later. The Gardner 5J engine. It's a 5-cylinder engine, which was in those days a very unusual setup. We do hear about modern cars produced with 5-cylinder engines, but there's nothing new on this earth. Bristol were fitting them a long, long time ago. Well, Bristol's didn't only make buses. They made a really good heavy vehicle just after the war. And many of these were made for and used by the British Road Service as articulated vehicles. We got a fine example of it done here in the British Road Service livery. These are articulated vehicles, and I remember when I was lorry driving seeing these trunking it up and down the A4 between Bristol and London on many an occasion. A very good solid vehicle, and I believe these did have the Bristol diesel engine in them. Well, here's a fine piece of kit built by Leylands of Lancashire, one of the best of the big, heavy British vehicle builders. This is the Super Hippo, and it really was a Super Hippo. Most of the Hippos were built as a forward control vehicle. This is the bonneted Hippo, and built purely for export. They should have gone to Rhodesia, all of them, but some stayed behind. This one particularly, and ended up in the company of John Lang and Co. Well, having done a few years' work, like a lot of vehicles, it was destined for scrap, but it was sold off again and is now in the hands of Lenny Watts, a well-known vehicle restorer from Dorchester. It's a big super vehicle, typical of the British vehicles built just after the war. Solid, big Leyland's own diesel engine in it, and a fine piece of kit that Britain should be proud of. And talking about good British vehicles, well, what about this one? AEC. Well, we had a look at the AEC buses, but now we've got the AEC chassis, then the 8-wheeler, the Mammoth Major, carrying a tanker. Now, this old tanker's got quite a bit of history, and several hundreds of thousands of miles behind it. And it's called Apollo. Now, I remember, as a lad, Wincanton Transport Engineers, WTE was their motto, and they used to have a badge with "Wheels Turn Efficiently" written around it, another meaning of WTE. And on the side of all those vehicles, they had various nursery rhymes. I remember them coming through the village with Bo Peep and Tom Thumb and all those names. And then they always carried on with a name for each vehicle. And this is the last of the fleet. Now, if you see Wincanton vehicles or anybody else's vehicles, they're usually just a monotonous appearance. But this was a vehicle used back in the days when people were proud of their fleets, and they were owned by very proud people. And Wincanton Transport have really got something here to remember that era by, and that's what this meeting is all about, remembering the past, that fine bit of AEC engineering and a little bit of history from Wincanton Transport. Well, talking to Lenny Watts and preserving vehicles, this is Lenny's pride and joy, I think, because I remember back many years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, at the Abbey Hill Steam Rally in Yeovil, when Lenny turned up with this old Leyland that he'd found in a very derelict state. He turned up with just the engine and chassis and the steering, and he was sitting on a box to drive it. And over the years following, Len would come along with a little bit more woodwork done, until eventually he had restored it back to its original state, the Eldridge Pope Brewery lorry. It's a very rare one and well worth preserving, because old pre-war Beavers of this type are rare, and this is the only one in the country with the old 4-cylinder Leyland diesel engine in it. So full marks to Len. He's made a good job here, and another old vehicle that's not going to die for a few years yet. And talking about vehicle collectors, well, we've got military vehicle collectors as well. Terry Hounslow from the other side of Sherborne, a very keen military vehicle collector. And this is his pride and joy. It's the big Diamond T. Now, Diamond T's produced this vehicle during the war for British use. It was not an American military vehicle as such, although they did use quite a few, but most of them were built purely for our tank transporting. At that time, Diamond T's could produce about 1,000 vehicles a month, whereas poor old Scammell, our tank transporter people, were turning out about 11 a month, which wasn't enough to compete with. They were originally built with a big Hercules diesel engine in them. This one has been converted to Rolls-Royce power. It was a far more reliable job, but it's a fine example of a wartime vehicle, and as you can see by the plate on the front, Terry, the enthusiast, took it all the way to France and back for the 50th commemoration parade of D-Day this year, and at his rate of fuel consumption, it was quite an expensive journey. We're still on about military vehicles because this old AEC Mammoth Major here, the six-wheeler, is a little bit short wheelbase for a normal flatbed six-wheeler, because it actually lived here for many years at Yeovilton as a refuel tanker. Fine bit of engineering by AECs. It's a 5-speed gearbox, AEC's own engine, and these were very popular with all the hauliers, as most AECs were. If you follow along the line, we've got that attractive old Foden. These Fodens came out around about 1950. That's called the S18 cab on that one. And I remember when they came out, very unusual feature did that Foden have. The speedometer is mounted right in the centre of the steering wheel. Now, they didn't build their own engines, Fodens. They fitted the Gardner 6LW engine. What a fine engine that was. We talked about the bus earlier having a 5J engine, but this is a 6-cylinder 6LW. It produced, I believe, 102 brake horsepower at 1,700 revs. Not a very fast vehicle, but they went on for a long time. There are a lot of those old Gardner engines still in preservation in vehicles like the Foden. Another Gardner engine vehicle next to it is the Curran's 8-wheel Atkinson. Now, Atkinsons, like Fodens, built steam engines and steam lorries way back in the turn of the century, but of course turned over to diesel when diesel became much more economic. And we can just see the bonnet there of an old Scammell. Now, that's well worth having a look at, because that too has got the same Gardner 6LW engine. So we've got 3 lorries there with virtually the same engine in. The old Scammell up there is one of Pickford's old lorries, one of the old 4-speed Scammells as opposed to the usual 6-speed. 4-speed gearbox on that because it's actually a chain drive vehicle. And there, up the end, well, something I'm very pleased to see today, Massey Wilcox, a firm that I was one of the pioneers for that firm back in the mid-50s. That's a Leyland Comet. The bonneted Leyland that came out in the 50s caused a lot of controversy because it didn't look like the old square cabs that Leyland had always produced previously. But they turned out to be an excellent lorry, and they had what's known as the Briggs cab, and we shall see similarities to that cab later on the Ford Thames 4Ds. They also fitted them onto Dodges. Of course, this is a time now after the war when vehicle manufacturers are buying in products from other bodybuilders, etc., and beginning to lose their individuality. Good morning, Robert.
Good morning, Jerry.
Nice to see you. Nice to see the old Comet down here as well. Now, I'm talking now to Robert Wilcox, director now of the Massey Wilcox concern. How many lorries you got up there now, Robert?
35.
35. Well, you remember I was one of the, I did say the pioneers of the firm.
That's
back
correct.
in 1956.
Yeah.
When I worked for, and Doug and Harry, they're still okay.
Yeah,
That's
they're still both alive and
originators
kicking.
and
Yeah.
kicking well too. So you've just renovated this one over the last few years, I
Yeah,
understand.
3 years, yeah. We found it in 1991. It's a 1954 model, which makes it the same year as the business started. It's a Somerset vehicle, which makes it all the more desirable for us in the Somerset company. And we ran just one of this model in 1959, I think it was.
Yes, I remember that only too well. And of course, back when I was driving, you had a similar cab to that in circulation on one of the old Dodge Cubes.
Yeah, that was the
It's
first.
the old Briggs cab.
We bought that Dodge. That was Doug and Father's first new lorry, and they got very drunk when they bought that.
And I haven't sobered up since.
Yeah.
Lovely talking to you, Robert.
And you,
May
Jerry.
the firm go on a long time, plus the old Comet. Thank you very much. Well, now we're going to talk about a real treasure. It's a very rare vehicle. It's the Opel Blitz. This vehicle belongs to Nick Baldwin. Now, Nick writes books about historic and interesting commercial vehicles, and he's the very proud owner of this, what I think almost unique in this country, the 4-wheel drive 6-cylinder Opel Blitz vehicle built for the German army. He found this in France. He got very little information from the owner as to how he came by it. Probably better we don't know, but it has got a bullet hole or two in it. If you look at the engine in this lorry, you'll find it's very similar to the Bedford engine, because Opel and Bedford, their parent company, was of course both General Motors of America. Next to that, talk about General Motors and parent companies, we've got the Bedford Model O, and what a beautiful example that is. It's a cattle lorry, and to drive one of these Bedfords was always a pleasure. And I remember them so well because they were fitted with the 27.3, everyone called the 28 horsepower Bedford engine, 6-cylinder overhead valve, 4-speed gearbox. Reliable, smooth, wonderful brakes on the Bedfords too, better than any of their competitors. In fact, I would say that Bedford was certainly the best of the middleweight commercial vehicles. The song of the Bedford, it produced better music than any of the big band sounds during the war. It really was lovely to listen to. As too was the musical sound of the gearbox on the next one along, the Ford 7V, the furniture van belonging to Crew Furniture Emporium. That's got the Ford V8 engine in it. It was quite a high-speed engine, not so good in the hills as the Bedford, but certainly not as good going downhill. As opposed to the Bedford servo-hydraulic brakes, the Ford 7V thought it was good enough with cable brakes. Now, I've driven those in tipper form, and you wanted a week's notice to stop the darn thing, I can assure you. Very uncomfortable driving position, very awkward gear change on them, but how nice it is to find these vehicles still in preservation. Vehicles that we criticised when they were around in their time, but it's wonderful to see them restored, and to me, very nostalgic to hear them running and to hear that music in my ears that I was used to back when I was around about 18 years old. Now then, a little bit further down the line, there's somebody we must go and talk to. Godfrey Martin. You must meet Godfrey. Right, good morning, my old friend Godfrey.
Good morning.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
You have a good trip down?
Lovely. Quite well.
This is a gentleman here who has his own haulage business, and he's had a haulage business, I believe, since about 1934, and he's still working, and he won't mind me telling you, he's 82 this last August. He was 82, and still driving a transit van 4 or 5 days a week. Not satisfied with that, he brings one of his own old vehicles, and you've had this one since new, Godfrey, haven't you?
1954.
Used it for 10 years?
10 years hard. General haulage all over including the continent.
Done a bit of continental with it. And then I remember seeing about 7 or 8 years ago, you brought about into preservation, having made a lovely renovation. 7 years. Yeah. And this has got the Perkins P6 engine in. It's a Seddon diesel. And what made you choose a Seddon? They had a pretty good name in those days?
Well, they were a very popular vehicle. That Conrad Bedford Dodge was about the leading vehicles for the 7-ton vehicle, carrying a 50% overdose.
Yeah, I remember when they came in first with the P6 too. It was certainly more economic than the petrol engines that were on the road of those days.
So, yes.
And have you got the 2-speed axle in this one?
No,
this is just
Moss,
a straight the Moss axle with a 5-speed gearbox.
5-speed David Brown gearbox.
Yeah, and you do quite a few miles in this year alone, just going to various rallies.
In 6 months, from May the 1st to October the 30th, 2,000 miles in 6 months.
That's not bad.
The rally season.
Not bad on top of a week's work either, Godfrey.
Not too bad at all, no.
3 times I can tell you that Godfrey did the London and Brighton and won the cup for the oldest person taking part in a lorry on that occasion. They give up asking him to go because he used to win it just a little bit too easy. Another one that I look at with great nostalgia reminds me of the local brewery lorries in our area. They had several of these, Beavers and Badgers of this type. It's a well-built vehicle, as all Leylands were. That one's got the diesel engine in it. But a characteristic of that day was the old temperature gauge up there on top of the Leyland radiator. But Leyland's always built a good solid vehicle, and if you could sit up in the cab of that and get that commanding view out over the long bonnet and looking down at your headlights and front mudguards, you'd never want to drive a modern vehicle again. Now we're swinging in now to the Guys of Wolverhampton, made many a strong, reliable, middle and heavy range vehicle. This is the Otter diesel. They were also noted for making the Wolf, which was another very popular vehicle. Some of them were fitted with Meadows engines, and some were later fitted with Perkins. Now Guy held as their esteemed badge of rank the Indian head, and there you've got the Indian's head on the radiator cap there, unfortunately painted. They should be in just an ordinary die-cast finish. Their motto was feathers in our cap, hence the Indian's head there. But a very good vehicle, this Guy, very reliable. And did a lot of wartime work too with their artillery tractors. Now, we're back to AEC again. We've certainly had our share of AECs, haven't we, today? And they're very prolific here. Now, this one was a fire service vehicle, you can see by the doors there, but it's been purchased privately now and chopped off and used for hauling a vintage tractor around to the shows as well. This is the AEC Mercury. I don't know whether that's 6 or 7 litre engine, but it's AEC's old engine. They fitted their own engines, 5-speed gearbox, and an excellent vehicle to drive. Nothing ever steered better than AEC. Certainly a good example of a British heavy, that, and it's very nicely restored. Now Barry James has turned out this year with the Morris, the BMC Morris. Of course, by this time in the 50s, Morris was in with Austin as the British Motor Corporation. This is a 5-litre sort of 7-ton vehicle with a 5-speed gearbox. There might have been a 4 with a 2-speed axle. I'm not quite sure. There were a certain amount of variations on these particular models. Next to that, 2 Leyland Beavers. This was the post-war Beaver when Leyland began to bring out a more stylish cab. The one nearest to us, the grey one, is the more recent cab, but the furthest one over there, the green and cream, well, that is the type of cab that they brought out round about sort of 48, 49 period. 4-speed gearbox, Leyland's own engine, good solid engineering. Not so solid, but still very reliable and very popular, was the Thames Trader, the red vehicle there, with the pole on the back. Unusual Thames Trader, this one, because it's got 4-wheel drive and having been used either as ex-military or having been used for some cross-country use. Ford's built the 7V with the V8 engine that we spoke about earlier, and didn't have much success in the heavy commercial world, but when they turned over to diesel production with the small 4D and this, the Thames Trader, they certainly produced something that was more reliable and certainly very popular among the middle-of-the-road haulage contractor. And Albion's down on the end there. Fowler Brothers of Chard, belongs to Ron Motherseal. He's restored this immaculate Albion Chieftain of the 50s, and that would have Albion's own engine in, but the cab on that is called the Lad Cab because it was a cab common to Leyland, Albion and Dodge. Talking again now when firms are buying in common components for their use. But Albion, sure as the sunrise was their motto, and where you see Albion written on the front of their vehicles, you will always see the rays of the sun on there, a bit like a Japanese flag, but certainly nothing made in the Far East, built in Scotland, another fine example of British lorries. This is what I call a nice bit of preservation here. Not only is it a well-preserved old Guy that I've known for many years, it used to belong to a local man, Alan Fry, when it had an organ up in the back. But Sam and Daphne Godwin bought it back a few years ago when it had a Meadows petrol engine in it, but due to not being a very economic engine, they fitted a 4-cylinder Perkins in, restored it back to its original condition, and also restored it back to the original owner, Northover and Gilbert, the furniture removers. So not only have we got a good old British lorry preserved, we got a bit of British history, a bit of local history preserved as well. And it was only up at the Yeovil Festival Transport a few months ago that one of the old original drivers of this vehicle so proudly come and saw the old vehicle that he drove for a living. That's what preservation is all about. Well, whether you're a vintage vehicle enthusiast or not, it's pretty certain that you've heard of a Model T Ford. If you've ever watched Laurel and Hardy films, I'm sure you'll have seen many of them. Now here we've got a 1918 Model T here. There are millions of them built. And what a wonderful, reliable vehicle they were. It was a beginning by Henry Ford of mass production. They look rather light and flimsy, but you see them driven across country, and the way some of them were hammered about in their day, they certainly proved to be something very notable in motoring history. Very unusual vehicle to drive. It's got a little four-cylinder engine, but instead of the normal clutch and gearbox, it's got what is called the bank clutch principle, where you've got one pedal for pushing down and letting off for the gear change, you've got another pedal to push for reverse gear, and another one for the brake. It takes a bit of getting used to, but I have had the pleasure of riding in one, but not having driven one yet. But there she is, the famous old Model T4. Next to that is a Chevrolet. Not often do we see a Chevrolet in our country now. Chevrolet of General Motors brought their vehicles over to this country as commercial vehicles and were in use for several years. This particular one goes back to around about 1930-ish. And then, of course, General Motors were in possession of Vauxhalls, and Vauxhalls then started producing their own commercial vehicles in the name of Bedford. But this Chevrolet is an earlier model. It's the Model R, and what an unusual vehicle it is to see at any rally. It's quite a rare exhibit. Over next to that, we're back to the Morris Commercials again. That's the Morris Commercial 1-ton chassis, and it's always a pleasure to see those old lorry. It was a four-cylinder side valve engine. Morris produced side valves for many, many years in the commercial vehicles, right up until the late 40s. A 3-speed or a 4-speed gearbox, depending on the weight of the chassis, but very well built for a lightweight commercial. And I remember George Pryor of Midsummer Norton, our local lemonade man, had a vehicle identical to that one belonging to Lansdowne and Son there, and I get quite a lot of memories of my childhood by seeing that wonderful old Morris commercial. Well, I've just been sitting once again, first time for a long time, in the little A35 van here. It's a 1960-ish model, but I once owned the car version of this, and what a sweet little machine it is too. Little four-cylinder overhead valve engine, very cheap to run. Of course, Austin's producer, Austin 7, is a cheap running small vehicle, and they certainly kept up tradition with the A35. But something a little bit bigger, and it's a bit more powerful, is the V8 Pilot. Now here's an interesting pickup here. Very rare to see a pickup too, because the V8 Pilot saloon was a very much used vehicle after the war, especially with police forces throughout the country. A big Ford V8 engine in it, and I believe still a heavy chassis on this one, which most of the stuff after the war had done away with chassis and gone into unit construction. Not a very economic vehicle, 3-speed column change, but certainly a comfortable car and a very quick mover. And this very well preserved pickup, a rare vehicle and a pleasant sight to see. Well, how many of you remember the Bedford OB? This is a 1950 bus. Bedford's been making the OB buses since just before the war, and I remember the old utility body ones. But this particular bus is very interesting because it was bought by Leathers Coaches in 1950 and used and kept by them ever since. This is a one-owner bus, still in original condition. And what a lovely condition that is too. But great buses, lovely to ride in. They had that beautiful Bedford song that you could hear when you were sat up in there, that made a lovely background to the songs you used to sing coming over from the seaside back in the 50s that I remember so well. It's a fine example of a fine coach preserved by a very fine firm. Well, we're down here now in the main arena among the vehicles and the Auto Jumbo, where all these enthusiasts congregate and look around and try to find bits and pieces for their present vehicle or something else that they're building up. Because not only do they like to collect vehicles, they like to fully equip them with authentic equipment that those vehicles would have had on them during their service career. We were talking to one very interesting chap, Robert Bolton, a little while ago, who's got a Jeep, and he's still hunting for just one spanner to complete his kit for his Jeep. That's the fanaticism of these vehicle owners. Well, behind us you can see a fine display here of bits and pieces. Quite a lot of that will be gone by the end of the day, or so the owner hopes. And to start off with our interesting vehicles, the owner of this Auto Jumbo collection here has got this little car here that I've admired for many years. It's a Morris Tilly. Morrises and Austins and Hillmans and Standards made Tillys during the war, Tilly being short for utility vehicle. As you can see, this is based on the 1938-39 Morris 10 Series M. It's got a little four-cylinder engine in there, just the same as the car, the unitary construction, just the same as the Morris car, and the four-speed gearbox. But they were cut off behind the driver's cab with this little utility body on there. Quite often you would have seen them driven by the ATS, and they were sort of to take officers around and a small amount of gear. But of course later on in the war they were replaced by the one and only Jeep. Very authentic colouring and markings on the front. Over here we've got the blue square with the gold griffin on, or rather the wyvern I should call it, because that is the Wessex wyvern. That divisional sign there shows that she belonged to the 43rd Wessex Division. And all British military vehicles had the plate on the front called the bridge plate. This yellow plate with a black number on it. That black number shows the weight of the vehicle, and if it ever comes across a bridge with a lower number than that is displaying, then it's not allowed over there. So we should be seeing several div signs and several bridge plates as we go round. It has a number on the side. I don't know if you can see it on camera there, but it's M4987765. M would be the series of the lightweight vehicles. Later on we should be seeing some with L and T and C and other prefixes, and we should talk about that and try and give you some interest that the Military Vehicle Club shares with you here today. Well, the vehicle you're looking at now is, well, it's got to be my favourite down here today, because it's an old Morris quad of World War II, identical to the vehicle that I did my army driving test on. And of course, being an artilleryman, those old colours bring back certain feelings of nostalgia. And here with us today, we got someone in charge of this vehicle now, Jeff Hewitt. Hello, Jeff. How long have you been running the old quad down here?
This is my 4th season.
What do you like to think about driving it?
Well, it's different, obviously, with the accelerator being in the centre, and there's more thinking distance than there is braking distance on this because of the weight.
That's quite true, but they were a wonderful, reliable old vehicle in their time. It's got a four-cylinder side valve engine built by Morris's, identical to the old Morris tippers of those days, the CV model. An updraft carburetor, quite old-fashioned in their setup. It's got the autovac instead of a petrol pump on it. Of course, it's four-wheel drive, and I believe this is permanent four-wheel drive, Jeff, this one?
Yeah.
This is the Mark
Yeah,
1.
this is permanent with a low ratio facility on it as well.
Yeah, it's got the low ratio facility, but of course the one I drove did have an optional four-wheel drive on it.
No, this is definitely permanent.
This is the old Mark 1, yes. And of course 42, that would be your arms of service number there, and the red and blue square always shows the artillery. This interesting number on the front shows which troop you were in and what gun you were in the troop, because there were 4 of these in each troop, 8 to each battery and 3 batteries to each regiment. Now, show us around the rest of it. We've got the linkage here where the winch comes out, because it's no good having a vehicle like this with a 25-pounder and a limber on soft surface if you haven't got a winch. And the old Morris had a damn good winch on it, Jeff, didn't it?
That's right, 240-foot winch.
Yeah, it really is a great bit of machinery. Let's have a look inside, can we? To the crew cab. Not the quietest of places to be driving in.
No, it's nice and warm though. You know, once the engine heats up, you can really kick off some heat from the engine compartment, but it is noisy.
Yeah, but of course that's something they weren't looking for in these days, because this is the North Africa campaign colours, and they weren't looking for that heat then. They were looking for other things.
Well, that's it. If you look up a bit, you can see that the old sunroof comes open and the front windows fold out, so you can get a lot of air coming in, as well as a lot of sand as well.
And of course you've got the limber on. How many rounds could you carry in the limber here, Jeff? 32 rounds. That was 25-pounder stuff. And have you ever worked on a 25-pounder gun?
Not for real, no. I've actually been with them when they've been firing for real, but I've never actually worked on one for real. I've fired blank, but that's about it. I did mine on pack howitzers.
Well, I transferred from the first field to the second field, and I didn't tell them I was a good signaller. They just thought I was just a spare bod, so they put me on the guns for a day or two, and it wasn't long before I told them I was a damn good signaller. I want to get back on the radio sets again rather than suffer the ear bashing I was getting on those 25-pounders. But it's a wonderful bit of kit you've got here. And does it belong to the Bovington Museum?
No, it doesn't belong. It's privately owned by the Royal Artillery Wing up at Bovington Camp. It's owned by a syndicate there. It was bought by the wing in 1975, the quad alone. Then we acquired the Limber at a later stage, and the gun is still actually in service.
About the div signs on here, I see you've got the North African desert rat over there.
No, well, it saw a lot of its service in the Far East and Middle East, and obviously during the desert campaigns. And obviously the desert rat was given to the gunners who were involved with this battle group of 8th Armoured.
And the old red and blue square, that shows she's artillery, and most of the artillery field regiments were 42, 43 and 44. You always had 3 regiments in a division usually, and then you had the 8 guns in a battery, 4 in each troop and 3 batteries in each regiment. I do remember that little bit about it. And now we're coming along to the Limber. That's where we carried the hot stuff, the old shell cases and the missiles themselves, the 25-pounder, that wonderful thing that did a lot of use during the war. How many could you put in here?
32 rounds
32
and charges,
rounds.
yeah.
And then on to the gun itself, and this is one of the early, you said this was a 1939, you told me just now.
Yeah, this is a Mark 1.
Mark 1 25-pounder, and what a sight to behold when the gunners were doing their drill and operating these. It's pretty to watch them down on one knee, the old ramrod tucked under the arm there. I've done a little bit of it myself. And here's the big the platform here that you pull the wheels up on so you can rotate your gun. And she's still operational?
Blank firing only now. It's ceremonial use.
Yeah. It has been used recently for ceremonial?
Yeah, well, I'll be doing Remembrance Sunday again, firing a 2 minutes salute again this year on the 14th of November. To start off the 2 minute silence and to finish the 2 minute silence as well.
Well, that's really great, Jeff, and it is nice for me, an old gunner, to come back and see the old quad gun in Limber again, and nice chatting to someone enthusiastic as yourself, a modern artilleryman. Thanks a lot. Well, we're going over now and see what the Yanks contributed to our wartime use. Thanks a lot again, Jeff.
Thanks so much.
Well, I'm leaning now on a heavy bit of kit. This is a Diamond T 969. Diamond T produced thousands of vehicles during World War II. One was a big heavy tank transporter. This is a very common wrecker used by the British Army and the American Army, and in fact I think the Americans used this one, left it over on the continent, and that's how the present owner came to have it in his possession. And we've got the present owner here with us now. That's Dick Shepherd from Sturminster Newton. Good afternoon, Dick. Nice to see you.
Not too bad, Jerry.
And how long have you had this one?
Oh, I've had her about a year now. And she's ex-Norwegian Army. She was still being used in the Norwegian Army up until about 2 years ago. And then when they had the auctions over there, the money obviously went straight back to America because they were over on the Marshall Plan, which happened in 1945. And the Norwegians were still using her up until last year.
Now, I know a bit more about the Diamond T transporters than I do these, because they had the Hercules diesel engine. What engine's in this one?
It's got the Hercules petrol engine, 135 horsepower, side valve, 6-cylinder.
Now, you're quite a character for these petrol engines, because you used to have a Mack with a petrol engine that did about 2 to the gallon, Dick. Now, how many did this one do to the gallon?
This one does about 3.5.
Oh, you've come up in the world a bit now. And, of course, being a wealthy man, you took it... Where did you take it this year?
I took her to France this year, to Normandy. I did about 600 miles. Well, 595 to be precise, and all I had trouble with her was she feathered up on one plug.
Well, that wasn't too serious. They're pretty reliable vehicles. The Diamond, all the heavy American stuff was just built to take the weight. There's quite a pokey winch on the front of this one.
Yeah, that's a Garwood winch, 10-ton winch, made by Garwood of the USA, and the wrecking gear on the back is a Holmes wrecking gear.
Yeah, these were always standardly fitted with the Holmes wrecking gear. They had the arms out the side and everything. How many speed gearbox on this one, Dick?
She got a 5-speed gearbox, then you got low range, 6-wheel drive.
And what sort of cruising speed?
Well, being 2.5 miles, 3 miles a gallon, I'd keep her down to about 35.
That's not too bad. Anyway, here's another of your old mates on the way now. We might have a chat with him later. Thanks a lot, Dick. Yeah. So there we are. Thanks for helping us out with the old 969 Diamond T. Well, I wasn't very high when I first saw one of these vehicles. About that high, I reckon. 1942, when the Yanks came over to England to help us out with the war and went tearing up and down through our village, sometimes with the local girls up in the back. but this is the big, well-known 2.5-ton GMC known as the Big Jimmy. 6-wheel drive, a big 6-cylinder overhead valve engine, 5-speed gearbox, 2-speed axle, and interchangeable alternative shift for the 6-wheel drive. Smashing vehicles to drive, and I rode in them as a kid then, and I've driven them since. But this was the popular cargo load carrier for the American Army, and we saw thousands of them during the war. And after the war, they were still used in France quite a bit, and you can still go to France and see them in use now. They were really hard-working, reliable vehicle built by the General Motors Corporation, of course, who's the parent company of Bedford and Vauxhall in this country. There she is, the 2.5-ton Big Jimmy, the GMC, one of my old favourites. Well, you were with us just now, weren't you, when we were talking about the Morris Tilly that belonged to Clive Silcox over there, the Morris 10 Tilly. Well, this is Austin's version of the Tilly, the Austin 10 Tilly. Very similar in style, identical in use, just a utility vehicle for officers to be taken around in before the Jeep became commonplace. A 10 horsepower Austin car, chopped off with a utility body on. Just another version of our many Tillys that were very popular in use at the beginning part of the war. Well, we've already made a couple of references to the Jeep, and here's the first one we've got to chat about today. It's a Willys Jeep, around about 1942. The Jeep was designed for the American Army and built both by Ford and Willys, almost identical. It's got a just over 2-litre side valve engine, 6-volt lighting, 3-speed gearbox with a 2-speed axle, and of course the 4-wheel drive. But what a wonderful, popular little vehicle they turned out to be. Go anywhere, anyhow, and they were built in quite a few different varieties. Some of them were built with stretchers on, etc. And it's nice to see that this one's got side curtains on. That was never built as standard. A lot of people put these adaptations on later in their service life when they found that they were in rather cold areas. But the Jeep put up such a stalwart performance during the war that it was them that inspired Rovers in 1947 to design the Land Rover, in fact on the identical wheelbase to the Jeep, the 80-inch wheelbase. Well, there she is, the good old Willys Jeep. Well, this is a little bit different. This is a staff car with the senior officers travelling around in brigade, etc., certainly not in the field. A better, more comfortable car was required than the Jeep or the Tilly. So cars like this, the Humber, were quite often used, and this is the Humber with a big 6-cylinder engine. Probably the big Humber Pullman of civilian use, but this is just an army version of a civilian car. An infantry flash here. JP, I forget what div sign this one is, but it is an authentic divisional sign, and it's nice and interesting to see how the enthusiasts try and bring back these vehicles to their original specification and colouring. Jeep again, you say. Slight difference here. This was sent for the British Army, and the British Army always fitted them with the standard British side lights. You can always pick out the British one, and it's got the M marking and the same 54th Divisional markings on here, and back to the old 2-ton bridge plate. So there we are, just yet another Jeep, but this time with British markings. Wolsey's, yet another example of a staff car, the Wolsey 18. Remember how popular these were with the police forces just before the war and just after. It's a really nice big 6-cylinder engine in there, overhead camshaft engine, 4-speed gearbox, and of course the ideal car to take the general or 2-star general or brigadier, whoever it was in there. And how interesting to see that this enthusiast has even done a restoration here and put the blackout masks on that we remember so well during the war, that were allowed people to see you coming, but be damned if you could see where you were going. There she is, the Wolsey 18, and what a fine example of it is too. Well, there's something here for everybody at the Alta Jumbo, whether it's a German helmet or an old type petrol can, and a nice set of jerry cans there, all on Mike Manning's stand. And of course Mike Manning, the proud owner of this Bedford QL. Ask any British soldier his favourite lorry during World War II, then he would say the Bedford QL. Lovely vehicles to drive. The Bedfords, first of all produced the 3-ton Model OY, which was a 3-tonner with only 2-wheel drive. That famous Bedford 28 horsepower engine and 4-speed gearbox. And then at the beginning of the war, it was decided that 3-tonners should and would perform better with a 4-wheel drive, and Bedford produced more of those 4-wheel drive 3-tonners than anybody else, and the QL was the most popular and the favourite. And even after the war, a lot of people like lime spreaders took on these old QLs to do their cross-country work. A lovely sounding vehicle, very nice to drive, very good performer, and as I said before, the favourite among the Army drivers. I love them. Well, still talking about Bedfords, we had a look at that big QL. Now we're talking about the little brother now, the 15 underweight Model MW. Now, a little 15 underweight, 2-wheel drive Bedford, designed just before the war for ordinary personnel conveyance, but still the same engine in that as you saw in the big QL earlier, the 28 horsepower overhead valve engine Bedford, built by Bedford. It's a superb little job, this. They were engine speed governed as opposed to the bigger ones, but the power to weight ratio on this was quite good, and of course they had a good cross-country performance, although they only had 2-wheel drive, because the British Army insisted on these balloon tyres. And an interesting thing about the wheels on the British system was that you see those red nuts around the wheel there. They are the idiot-proof nuts. Ordinary unskilled drivers do not touch those nuts, because they are there not to take the wheel off, but to separate those two rims to take the tyre off. Another interesting feature of British vehicles are the sling rims on here. Didn't have drive on and off ferries in those days when they wanted to take their vehicles abroad, so they had these flanges put on the wheels so that you could put a rope sling around to lift them up on the cranes to take them on and off vehicles. Well, there you are, a very nice example of the Bedford 1500 weight. And talking of 1500 weights, well, here's Morris Commercial's version. Morris made several Model 1500 weights, the C4, the CS8, and this is the C8. In 1944, the Army authorities insisted on all 1500 weights had to be 4-wheel drive. So Morris had to produce a 1500 weight version of their CS8. The easiest way to do it was to put a 1500 weight wooden body, and in some cases a metal body, onto the old chassis of that Morris quad that we saw pulling the artillery gun just now. So that's all that is really. It's a 1500 weight vehicle version of the quad. 5-speed gearbox and that old 4-cylinder side valve engine. But in here they took away the Autovac petrol feed system, which wasn't terribly reliable, and did put a proper mechanical pump on it. But one of my old favourites, I used to own one of these. I went to Normandy in mine in 1984, and I see that young Paul Harms, who owns this one, went this year as well, and I'm sure he must have had a very noisy but enjoyable ride in the old Morris C8 1500 weight. Or not only do you produce fighting vehicles and personnel carriers, of course, unfortunately we can say you have to produce a lot of ambulances. America produced many ambulances for her forces over here, the most common one being the Dodge. 6-cylinder side valve Dodge engine, very well tried engine it was too, and here we are with a 4-speed gearbox, 2-speed axle, 4-wheel drive, so they could just about get anywhere to pick up the unfortunate bodies. And this particular one here is fully equipped with stretchers in the back, very authentic, and a fine example of the vehicle that was doing grand work from 1941, 42 onwards, the Dodge ambulance. Now, when a lot of people talk about Daimlers, they expect to see some big limousine pull up in front of them, but this is a Daimler. This is the Daimler Scout car, designed in about 1938, affectionately known as the Daimler Dingo. It was used by armoured regiments and a lot of the cavalry regiments actually too, because the horses become obsolete during World War II in action, so the Scout car was used. It's got a 6-cylinder petrol Daimler engine in it, and the famous old Wilson pre-select gearbox with a fluid flywheel. So on here you've got 5 speeds that you pre-select, and to go into reverse you just reverse your lever, and you've got 5 reverses there as well. Ideal for retreating, I would say. I've seen these in action with various regiments when I was in Palestine, and the 17th 21st Lancers, they used theirs with railway wheels on, actually, to go ahead of us on the railway trains just to check that there were no bombs on the line. So that's a rather hazardous life, but I remember with great affection this Daimler Dingo. It was the forerunner to many armoured cars, and a lot of other countries followed it through with armoured vehicles based on the principle of the Daimler Dingo. Well, we've had a look at two British 1500 weights, the Morris Commercial and the Bedford just now. Now we're over to the fastest of all the 1500 weights in the Army. This was the Ford V8 WOT 2. W-O-T was the prefix that Ford gave all their military vehicles. This was the WOT-2, their famous 1500 weight. Ford V8 engine, very fast engine. It had cable brakes, so that meant it didn't stop as quick as some. But it was a very popular vehicle by virtue of the fact that it was, I expect, 10 mile an hour faster than the majority of 1500 weights in the British Army. Very interesting bit of restoration here. This is the Tyne and Tees Regiment, their div sign being the double T there. And another thing we must point out, it's got the Allied Forces star. A lot of people get mistaken thinking that anything with a star on was an American vehicle, but we know when Ike and Montgomery got their heads together to plan the 1944 invasion of France, then all Allied forces had to put the Allied Forces star on them for that occasion. So here she is, the ever popular Ford V8 WOT 2. Well, we're coming down now to have a chat about our only amphibious vehicle here today, the GMC Duck. The proper initials were the DUKW, and it's based on the GMC chassis. We had a look earlier at the 2.5-ton Jimmy. Well, this is basically the same chassis, the same engine and gearbox, but it was built for amphibious purposes, beach landings, and a lot of our forces were equipped with these and used them in some of the Mediterranean landings. Quite a useful vehicle. We'll try and have some shots and look inside and see the setup of it later. But one interesting feature that we point out here is the tyre inflation system here, that you can actually inflate the tyres whilst on the move. That's so you can increase your pressures and give better buoyancy when you are in fact going to do a bit of cross-country work. It's a very useful vehicle. They weren't too popular at first with the American Army. They didn't find a lot of use for them, but after a bit of use in the Mediterranean and round, they certainly earned their keep and became certainly part of the old system and helping to get things together when we were landing on foreign soils and trying to clear up the odds and ends towards the end of the war. The famous Duck.